name is Azat Jodasevich. In case you do not know me, I'm the anti-corruption program coordinator within the UNODC regional office in Afghanistan, Central Asia, Iran, and Pakistan. Just to remind you, we are providing the simultaneous interpretation into Russian and English. Please select the channel. If you want to ask a question, please raise your hand. Be muted until you are allowed to talk. I can see and hear that someone's mic is not off. Now it's okay. So after the main body of the presentation, we will have time for the discussion. The meeting is recorded and it will be posted on YouTube. The link would be shared at our social media pages. And very soon, the previous video will hit 1 million viewers. So we are providing these presentations to train our specialists. Just, you can quote us, just please indicate the reference, the link, and we would like to thank Mr. Aliyev, the General Secretary of the Council in Kyrgyzstan, which initiated the training for the specialists in Kyrgyzstan. We will be more than happy if you invite us to your seminars. We will try to join you. The second point I would like to highlight, to discuss in the end, is the fact that we are considering issuing certificates for the attendees in case if they are passing the final exam successfully. Please let us know in the chat if you would like to take a part in this examination and get the certificate. The seminar is conducted based on the platform on fast tracking of the UNCAC, and we will speak today about the crimes which are related to bribery, embezzlement, misappropriation, and other diversion of property. Ms. Sierra will be making the presentation, the head of the Analytical Center of the UNODC in our region. Ms. Salome, over to you.
Thank you very much. Asad, can you hear me? Okay, and I don't know if you can see me. Yeah, that's very strange. For some reason, my camera is not working. Ah, okay, good. I don't see myself. Maybe I turn it off now. Well, I turn it on again. Thank you, Rustam. Good to see you too. Good morning, everyone. I think that Asad already introduced me. And I'm ready to start the session today. This is the session number 2, and today's session is very specific. We're going to discuss bribery and embezzlement. So we will be discussing in the first part all the indicators that are connected to bribery, and in the second part, the indicators under embezzlement. As you can remember, thank you for the slide. Just a refresher for those that maybe did not join the first session. In the first session, we presented this tool, the Statistical Framework to Measure Corruption, which is available in Russian for all of you to download and review. Next slide, please. And a refresher again, this statistical framework is basically a menu of indicators for countries to choose the topics that are more relevant for them to monitor. Can you please change the slide? The framework offers different thematic areas that are connected to the UN Convention Against Corruption, the UNCAC. And the framework has a list of indicators under each topic. And countries, of course, are encouraged to collect information connected to these topics if it's relevant for their national anti-corruption policies. Next one, please. The framework is divided in 3 dimensions. We have a dimension about the corruption areas that are criminalized under the convention. Then there is a second dimension that includes preventive measures. And then a third dimension that is connected with the environment to report and address corruption. For each one of these 3 dimensions, there are different types of indicators. We have direct measures and indirect measures. The direct measures are really indicators that can tell us what is the size of the problem. And then, because understanding the size of the problem is not enough, we have other indicators on the, let's say, indirect indicators that complement direct measures. We have indicators to see the perception around corruption. We have indicators to understand what are the opportunities and constraints connected to specific types of corruption. And then we have indicators to understand in terms of regulations, if countries are equipped, legally speaking, to address corruption. And finally, indicators that are connected to the effectiveness of the criminal justice system to actually engage in investigating and issuing sanctions or convictions because of corruption behaviors. So this is basically the very quick explanation of the framework. Next one, please. And today we will see the first 2 corruption areas that are criminalized in the convention. Like I said, bribery and embezzlement, misappropriation, or other diversion of property by a public official. Next one, please. So we have already explained the different types of indicators. I think in this slide is just a refresher. The direct measures or direct indicators help us to understand the outcomes. I mentioned the magnitude, but also the effectiveness. And why I mentioned the magnitude, because maybe we can understand the size of the problem, but then if we monitor over time and we see changes, let's say if we see that the number of cases of bribery is very high, but then if we keep monitoring this indicator and we see that the number is going down, we might think that there is effectiveness in the interventions, let's say, to prevent bribery from happening. But this is just a start, an initial idea. We will discuss more in detail what are the implications of each indicator. Perception indicators are very interesting. We heard about perception indicators a lot. We all know Transparency International Index that it's very much about perception. And I mean, we encourage countries to measure perceptions themselves, not necessarily only rely on Transparency International Index, because when countries measure the perceptions themselves, they can go into details, not only understanding the percentage of people that think there is corruption in a country, but they can understand in which sector the citizens perceive that there is more corruption. They can even understand in which type of procedures, services, citizens perceive that there is more corruption of bribery. So in a way, perception, of course, is very informative, but it can be biased, because sometimes what happens is that if there is a scandal, for example, some people may think that there's more corruption, and depending on what happens after the scandal, the perception can also be influenced. For example, if after this scandal related to corruption, the government shows that some people were put into jail, then people would think that the fight against corruption is very effective. So maybe the perception of corruption is going to go down. So again, perception is very interesting. It shows to what extent people is informed about corruption, but it's very tricky, because just looking at perception is not really telling us if corruption is increasing or decreasing. So many questions around corruption. And then risks, I think I already mentioned a bit what we are trying to measure with these kind of indicators. Same with other, the ones that are de jure indicators that as I mentioned, are more connected to the legal framework and the way the legal framework was created in each country. We're going to discuss that in detail in this session, thanks to Asat. And then finally, we have the indicators of response. These are actually, like I said, related to the criminal justice system, and in a way show us the capacity of the criminal justice system to respond. Now, next one, please. For bribery, we have 14 indicators in this statistical framework to measure corruption. In this slide here, you only see indicator 1 to 6. You see how we have some 3 indicators on the direct measures, and then we have perception, and in this one you can only see risk, specifically the constraints. Regarding the first 3 indicators, especially number 1 and number 2, this is the prevalence of bribery in dealings with public officials among the population. So this is how many people experience bribery directly when interacting with government. The second indicator is the same, but for businesses. So what is the percentage of businesses that experience bribery when dealing with a public institution? Then the third one is to give us an economic perspective of the value of bribery. So the indicator, as you can see, is the total monetary value of bribes paid by all people during 1 year time. And actually in here, in the total monetary value, we can combine how many people paid for a bribe and how many businesses paid for a bribe. So the way we get these indicators is through surveys, either population surveys in the case of the first one, and the third one, and business surveys in the case of the second one. So this is really very valuable to go out and really ask businesses and citizens about their experiences, because it's really the only way to get that information. And we'll talk a bit more about that in the coming slides. Then we have the one on perception. I think that we don't need more explanation on that one. Then we have the e-government, and this e-government is very interesting because it's to basically see how many citizens or businesses as well are getting their services sorted out, or their paperwork authorized, or their licenses authorized through internet. And if we monitor this indicator, we can also see to what extent the use of e-government is useful to stop corruption from happening. You can see there that the use of e-government is listed under the constraints, because there is an argument about how useful or effective is enabling public procedures online to avoid this direct contact between public officials and citizens, or between public officials and businesses. So it's also interesting to look at how e-government really helps to reduce the number of cases of bribery. Then there is another one that is the one on reporting bribery, because in this one, we can also understand a little bit to what extent are citizens or businesses willing to report public officials that asked for a bribe. And this can also help us to understand how many citizens or businesses reported these cases of bribery. And if they did, which authority they went to report this experience, or even in case of those that did not report it, why they thought it was not a good idea to report it. And this is very useful information for public officials to actually understand if there's any missing mechanism. And then we have the other ones. Now, the next slide, please. In this one, you see the other indicators. You see the ones on regulation and the ones on the criminal justice system. So this is detection, investigation, prosecution, conviction. Hopefully you can get some rates from there. But also we have a very ambitious indicator that is about the assets recovered after maybe someone was convicted because of bribery. This is really, really a very difficult indicator to get. It's very ambitious, but it would be interesting to see. And it happens. We know it happens. We've seen many cases. Then we have administrative sanctions as well to see if there's any conduct that can be also sanctioned through administrative procedures. Finally, next slide, please. In this slide, you can see the same indicators, but in here, I wanted to highlight where are these indicators coming from. So the ones in yellow are indicators coming from surveys. The ones on green are indicators coming from the legal system. And the ones in blue are indicators that can be estimated by getting information from institutions, from their administrative records. So I guess the most difficult indicators here are the ones that are obtained through surveys, but the ones in green and blue, the ones that are related to the legal system and the ones that are related with administrative records, those are more or less easy to get from literally every country. It's just a matter of establishing the mechanisms and coordination mechanisms to actually get the information, process it, and disseminate it and discuss it. So, in this slide, what I'm trying to show is the feasibility of getting some of these indicators right away, or pretty much easily, if I may say. Next one, please. Now, for the indicators that are coming from surveys, in the previous session, I already mentioned that UNODC has this manual to measure corruption through surveys. In the manual, I'm showing the two indicators that we already discussed. But if you access the manual, for those that have not seen the manual, you will see a description of the whole process for conducting a survey to actually collect this information. There are many considerations in this manual in terms of how much resources are needed are required to conduct this kind of surveys. We have some estimates of the budget that is required for you to actually do this kind of survey. We have many recommendations about how to have good methodologies to actually get good data. And we even have suggested questionnaires for you to adopt easily. In both cases, we have questionnaires for surveys to citizens and questionnaires to conduct surveys in businesses. So this is very useful for you to have in case you are interested in applying this kind of surveys in your country. Next one, please. And just a few more words about surveys. In this slide, you can see this iceberg, and we can see that the part of the iceberg that is visible is, in this case, the information that we get, for example, about bribery from the criminal justice system. So how many cases are there of bribery in the criminal justice system? How many investigations, let's say, or how many cases of bribery were reported? Like I said, this information can or is available in many countries from administrative data. So we can see that, and it's good to know how many cases were reported and how many cases are under investigation, but that only shows the tip of the iceberg. As you can see, the bottom of the iceberg in many cases is bigger than the cases that are reported. So the part that is not visible of the iceberg potentially is bigger. And what we see is that in many cases, victims or witnesses are not always willing to report. And of course, if we want to address this problem, we need to see beyond the surface. We need to see the actual size of the iceberg, and we need to see the shapes of the iceberg. What I'm trying to say here is, it's not enough just to know how many cases of bribery were reported. We need to understand in which sectors did these bribery cases happen, by which in which service these cases happened. And these two things are essential if we really want to tackle bribery from happening. So this is just to say that survey data is very powerful and complements administrative data to actually understand the size of the magnitude of the problem. Another slide, please. In this slide, what I show is on one side, the number of corruption cases that were reported. And this is, as you can see, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, and Uzbekistan. And the number of cases are the line, not the dotted line, the other one. So for example, in the case of Kazakhstan, no, this is not Kazakhstan, this is Uzbekistan, the green one. So you can see the evolution. In 2020, we got that in administrative records in Uzbekistan, the authorities recorded, let's say, 1,200 cases of corruption, then of bribery, I mean. Then in 2021, there was a huge increase, and the institutions in Uzbekistan showed that they have 8,000 cases. Then by 2022, there was a decrease. And then, another downward trend. And then in 2024, they're going up again. And this is interesting. But then if we look at the same country and we actually see the corruption perception index, that is the dotted line. In here, you can see the dotted line, the green dotted line, that it's the corruption perception index for Uzbekistan. We see, that between 2020 and 2021 and 2022, the trend of number of cases and the trend of the perception is not connected at all. There's no, they're not going in the same direction. So this is just to show that perception is not enough to understand corruption, and that actually it can be misleading because maybe in some cases it's not having the same trend. Although it's interesting, specifically in this country, because you see in 2024, now both the number of cases and the perception levels are kind of getting closer. But just to see another example, in Kazakhstan, we see the trend and we see the perception, and maybe there's some coincidences, but we don't really know, again, further details of why is this trend stable or more or less stable, or where, or in, where, when I say where, I mean in which sector or in which province, in which region. So we really need to go beyond number of cases and perception. We ideally, as policymakers, need more details to actually target interventions more effectively. Next one, please. And I think I already somehow mentioned this. So why focus on people experiences? Because it's more informative. We can get additional elements to understand where are the risks in terms of sectors, in terms of geographical locations, in terms of ways. In some countries, they ask for bribes. In other countries, they ask for gifts or favors. So we want to understand more. And finally, relying on information coming from surveys, we can also have a better picture of what is happening, because as we saw in the previous slide, administrative data is not necessarily complete and can also be affected by different things. One thing, for example, is that in many countries, citizens are not really willing to report, maybe because there is a lack of trust in the authorities. Maybe they think that nothing is going to happen after their reports. And when we see these things, when we see these reasons for not reporting cases of bribery, this is really an opportunity for authorities to improve the mechanisms maybe to report these kind of cases. But we need to understand to what extent people are reporting or not. So this is just to make the case of the usefulness of survey data to inform preventive policies of bribery. Next one, please. Now, this is just to show you how do we estimate the prevalence of bribery. So after conducting a survey, what we get is the way that we get the prevalence of bribery is by getting the number of people who paid a bribe or were asked to pay a bribe by a public official divided by the total number of people who had contact with public officials. People that were asked to pay for a bribe, but they did not or refused, should also be included in the computation to have a full picture. And one of the very important elements here to catch is that without contact, either direct or indirect, there cannot be a bribe. So really the contact element is very important. Now, if we actually go into the detail of the indicators, so you can see the kind of questions that we apply to get this information, we will see the questions directly. Next one, please. So this is one of the questions. In the last 12 months, have you had contact with any of the following of public officials through an intermediary? So this is, in a way, this is interesting. This is, again, establishing the contact in a specific time period and also understanding which type of official participated in this. So in here, we have the typical list of the officials that are included. To have police, judges, prosecutors, tax, public utility officers, passports, driving licenses, traffic management, doctors and nurses. And just to share with you, in many countries that are already applying this kind of surveys, we see important differences. In many countries, police and criminal justice officials are usually on the top, at the top of the ones that are reported as more engaged in bribery. But there's also developments. In some countries, we found some unexpected sectors involved in corruption. For example, the medical services, doctors and nurses, in some countries were reported as the ones that were even more engaged in bribery than police and judges. In here, we don't have teachers, but in some countries, we also include teachers because we get that that's also the case, and it's important to understand really where are these cases occurring. Next one, please. So another question is, a follow-up question is, was there any occasion when you had to give to any of these public officials a gift, a counter favor, or some extra money, including through an intermediary? And in here, we actually avoid using the word bribery because we think that when we use, well, it's not that we think, we have tested that when we use the word bribery, we get less responses. People do not want to accept that they actually were asked for a bribery, or even worse, that they gave this bribery or gift or counter favor. So the wording that we use is to make the respondents feel as victims and not as the ones maybe initiating this. And I already explained why we don't use the word bribery. Now, next one, please. In the last 12 months, was there any occasion when a public official directly or indirectly asked you to give a gift, a counter favor, or some extra money for an issue or procedure related to his or her functions, but you did not give anything? And these are some considerations. The requests of bribery following a refusal is also classified as bribery according to the convention. So it's in our interest to also measure it, and that's why we also included in the computation in this indicator. Now, next one, please. And actually, we can skip and go. We can skip this one because we already explained. It's all about the surveys. We can go to the next one. This is the one about e-government. And just to show you, the e-government coverage is measured by using the number of persons who carried out a public procedure through a digital platform in a certain period of time, that is 12 months, to have a yearly estimate that can be compared over time, divided by the total number of persons who carried out at least one public procedure in the last same reference period, multiplied by 100. And you see how we have some further guidance there, the definitions that we use for understanding what e-government means. So this is the use of information and communication technology by government agencies for increasing and improving accessibility of citizens to their services. And public procedures include all let's say procedures that involve issuing licenses, authorizations, and permits, and in some cases services, as well as keeping control on official documents. So this is what we try to get from this indicator. And ideally, we get information disaggregated by sex, because we want to know if men and women have different experiences, by age, to understand also, for example, in which age group these kind of services are more intensely used, and the type of procedure. So we can also match, for example, this indicator with the other indicators to actually have some comparison there, some analysis to see to what extent the use of e-government is really helping to decrease the number of cases of bribery. The next one, please. It's about the reporting of bribery. And I think this is just to show the ones that were asked for a bribery if they actually reported and to whom they did report it. And we only have this indicator, but like I said, usually in the questionnaires, we include the reasons for reporting, the reasons for not reporting, or the institutions to which citizens or businesses reported the experience. And this is important because in some countries, we have found that citizens may report bribery cases, but sometimes they report it to the wrong authority and nothing really happens. So that's why it's important also to have further details about the reporting behavior of cases of bribery. Now, up to here, we have only discussed survey indicators and the one on e-government that comes from administrative records. But now we're going to go to the other indicators that are also indirect, but that are all connected with the legal framework. And for this, I'm going to ask Asad to comment about the criminalization of bribery and the comprehensive definition of public officials that are the next indicators under bribery. So over to you, Asad.
Thank you, Salome. So let's move to the indirect measurements related to the response to corruption. The next slide. The corruption risks in all of the countries, they may be different. Then the approach used by the country to respond to this phenomena is also different. This is reflected in the legislation as well. And here we need to pay attention to the definition in the context of this indicator, definition of the bribery, which is used in the UNCAC, because every and each word used in this definition should be reflected in the legislation. It's not only the issue of harmonizing with the convention, but we need to understand that this will always impact on the way, on the deepness of the impact of the criminal justice over the corruption and in particular bribery. Where can we find the information? As of today, we already have the results from the first review cycle by countries, and we could use the recommendations which were provided as the result of the first cycle of the review. So in this time period, the countries, they tried to improve their legislation and made the relevant adjustments. To what extent it was done, fully or not fully, will help us understand the use of the methodology in combination, and when in practice you use the legal analysis with the statistics, then you will see that there is a clear link between the way these issues are regulated, de jure, and how the system to counteract corruption is actually fulfilling its functions de facto. On this slide, I would like to draw your attention to the fact that criminalization of each element is very important, and also criminalization of each and every step of the corruption case. For example, the promise to give a bribe or the proposal, this should also be criminalized together with the actual behavior, the actual act of giving or taking a bribe. The intermediary also plays a significant role. What is given? Is it a tangible thing or non-tangible? Maybe it could include non-tangible assets. That is why we use the illegal advantage for the public official or any other natural or legal person. Accordingly, when you compare the statistics on the criminal justice, you will be able to see that some of the cases could be expanded if some of the elements of bribery were reflected in the criminal legislation of the country. Hence, when we conduct such an assessment, we need to compare to what extent the legislation reflects all of these elements provided for in the convention. The next slide, please. Same principle is used here, and going back to the previous article on bribery, the definition of the public official is extremely important because in practice, different schemes could be used to organize bribery systematically when it's done often, and even the schemes could be used so the people who do not have functions of taking serious legal actions, still they play a key role in determining the financial flows from the bottom to top. And this is important when we counteract the systemic corruption. So definition of the public official should also be fully in compliance with the definition given in the UNCAC. And we should analyze the legal framework of the country. The next slide. Here we propose to review an indicative structure which could be used to understand whether there is a compliance or non-compliance throughout the periodical reviews of the statistical indicators within the proposed statistical methods to measure corruption. So what is needed here? At least to have 3 chapters, which from one hand define the legal framework. If it is not the first review, but the follow-up review, and you have the basic evaluation, you can even do the benchmarking, the comparison analysis throughout the certain period of time, what changes were made to the legislation. Then you can compare the provisions with the UNCAC, and as a result, making a conclusion whether you have partial, full compliance or non-compliance of the current legislation with the UNCAC provisions. So when you do the comparison of the changes made to the legislation with the statistical framework, the dynamics of the statistical indicators, for example, indicators on the number of the criminal cases or the people convicted, you will see this link in a certain time period, for example, a year after the changes were made, you will see this decrease or increase in certain types of the corruption cases which were revealed. And I guess most probably the same will be witnessed in the results of the survey, because when we introduce the new elements to the criminal legislation, very often it impacts on the behavior of the criminals. So through this comprehensive use of the methodology which is proposed by the UNODC, you will be able to see the link between the quantitative and qualitative indicators. Ms. Salome, over to you again.
Thank you so much, Asad. This is very, very relevant for the next slides. Next one, please. In this one, actually, we have those slides about the detection, investigation, prosecution, and conviction of bribery. So once we have, let's say, a solid definition of bribery, then the figures for these indicators will be as accurate as possible, at least so we have an understanding of the evolution of the action of the criminal justice system every year, because the idea is to monitor these indicators on a yearly basis. And then we have the one on assets recovery that I said is more challenging, and the one on administrative sanctions. Now, what I want to show you is how does these indicators look in practice. I wanted to give you an example, to share with you an example of the different data from one country. So next slide, and we are not going to stop, but next slide, 2 slides, next one. Yeah, this one. So in here you can see this is data from Mexico. Mexico has been conducting surveys to measure the prevalence of bribery on a yearly basis. They started in 2011. They collect data by surveys through population surveys. This happens every 2 years. And they also have surveys to businesses. And I think the surveys to business, it's available only every 3 or 4 years. But the important thing here is they have the data. So in here, I'm showing you the actual figures, for example, of prevalence. So in indicator number 1, this is the rate of people that experience a bribery when dealing with public officials. So if we summarize, we can say that 14 out of 100 experience a case of bribery in 2023. And this is interesting indicator because if you look, for example, at the indicator on perception, you can see that on the next column, the level of perception in the country, it's very, very high. You see, according to the survey, again, that they have of the population survey, they get that for the same year, 83% of the people consider that corruption is frequent or very frequent. So just to show you that to have kind of a superficial understanding, we can see that there is a gap between the actual experiences and the level of perception. There's no connection really in there. So there seems to be less cases than actually people think. Now, we see also here at the bottom, the number of $1 million that bribery represents for Mexico every year. This is 624 million US dollars. And I mean, we see this figure and we can think, well, it's huge, but we don't really know. I mean, is it really huge? We would actually need to think about it in comparison to the gross domestic product. Is it big in comparison to the expenditure of the government expenditure? We actually need to understand a bit more. But the important thing here is to have the figure, to have this discussion about how big is bribery in this case for the country. So now we see, for example, there under the indicators, the risk indicators under the constraints, we see that 48% of the population of 20 years old and above interact with government via internet in the same year. So this is a considerable amount, a percentage of the population. This is half. It's good to know, but again, we would need to look into this indicator over time to see if the use of internet is going up and if that is connected with the number of cases in specific sectors. So for example, if you have more people getting a license by internet, how is that connected with the number of cases of bribery of these people when they're getting licenses? If use of internet is going down, we might think that the number of cases of bribery is going up. The use of internet is going up. We immediately would think that maybe the number of bribery cases is going down. But this is a question, and actually we can only answer this question if we see these indicators over time, if we see the actual trend. Now it's interesting to see the percentage of cases that were reported. In here we have a figure, a rate as well. So we can say that 5 out of 100 reported their cases. So again, this is very, very little. If we see indicator number 1, this indicator, we see that not even half of the cases were reported. So 14 out of 100 experienced bribery, and only 5 out of 100 reported it. We need to look at why and where these things happened. Now, as Sat already discussed, the criminalization, but then if we look at number of cases that were actually investigated, and then people that were prosecuted and people that were actually convicted, we see also how the figure is going down. So we have over 2,000 investigations, and then out of those investigations, 140 people were prosecuted and only 60 were convicted. So it gives us a flavor of what is happening around bribery, about the size of the problem, about where is it happening, about what is population doing about it, and about what government is doing about it. And it's great to have this, let's say, picture of bribery, but actually what is even better is to monitor these indicators over time. And this is what I'm trying to show you in my next slide. Next one, please. Yes. So in here, basically, I translated some of these indicators based on the available data. So you can see the trend over time. So you can see how between 2013 and 2023, the perception of corruption is going down. So in 2023, we have 88.3 people that perceived that corruption was frequent or very frequent. And this came down in 2023 by, well, let's say 5 points more or less. In 2023, it's 83. So from 88 to 83, let's say, if we round up. And it's interesting to see the perception, but then if we see the experience here to the right, we see that in 2023, we have over 12,000 cases. And in 2023, the number is actually going up. Maybe not so much. This is almost 14, let's say 2,000 more cases, more or less, in this rate. But then, in a way, this contradicts what is happening in terms of perception, because what is going, if we see perception, the trend of perception, we can think that corruption is going down. But in reality, we see that overall, the rate of experiences of corruption is increasing. So we cannot just keep this in, we cannot keep our understanding of corruption just limited to perception. We need to look at experience. Now, in this slide, what we see, in this graph below, what we see is the people 20 years and older that actually use internet to interact with government. And this graph is a bit tricky. The green one is 2021, and 2023, it's the purple one. And actually, we can see that the percentage of people using internet was higher in 2021, and it came a bit down in 2023. And actually, there's no connection, because in 2021, we had more people using internet, and the experience, well, maybe we can argue that there is an impact, because the number of experiences of corruption, or in this case, bribery, in 2021 was a bit higher. So it now actually kind of contradicts, because 2021 we had more than half of people using internet and we had more corruption cases. But then in 2023, the number of people using internet is a bit low. And yes, corruption, I mean, the case of bribery went a bit down, but we cannot necessarily say that it is because of use of internet. And actually, this is one thing that I want to highlight. We have these indicators and we're having this reflection, but this is not conclusive. And this is why it's important to at least have indicators to have this conversation nationally with relevant stakeholders, and to have more questions about what is really happening in different sectors, in different procedures. But we need to have some information to actually understand or have some sense of what is happening. And now in here, finally, we have the number of cases that were reported. This is again the rate. And as you can see, it's more or less stable between 4,000, 5,000. And then in here in 2023, it's going down a little bit, but not as low as in 2017. So it's really tricky. We need to look into all the indicators and then see the evolution over time. Next one, please. These indicators in this next slide are the response indicators. So you can see this is criminal justice system, this is investigations, prosecutions, and convictions. And we see that the number of investigations every year is going down. The number of prosecutions apparently has a slight increase between 2021 and 2023, but it actually looks as the number of prosecutions between 2023 and 2019 is almost the same. So we can say it's improving, but really not so much. And the number of convictions, it's also not very high if we compare it, for example, of between 2023 and 2019. So the question here is what happened in 2021, that we really had a very small number of convictions. And this is why it's important to actually look into the three indicators together and to look into the trend and understand what is happening between each year. Of course, there are many questions. I mean, in here we can see in which type of sectors, in which type of procedures, by gender, by type of function, by age. We can have a lot of information, but let's say these are the most important indicators. So finally, next one, please. Some insights about bribery. These are just some reflections that we actually review. The gap between an experience and perception. If perception is going down, that does not necessarily mean that the number of businesses and citizens experiences corruption is going down. We need to have a bigger picture. Measuring the experience of corruption can help us to understand the size of the problem, to understand vulnerable sectors, and to understand the economic damage of bribery for the country. We can assess if e-government is actually useful to stop or prevent bribery from happening. We can monitor the willingness of citizens and businesses to report corruption. We can understand if the country is legally equipped or prepared to actually detect and investigate corruption. And finally, we can understand and have some sense of what is actually the criminal justice system doing in terms of corruption, in this case of bribery. So this is more or less the summary of the indicators about bribery. I don't know if, Sat, if there are any questions about bribery, or if we should continue with the next topic, that is embezzlement, misappropriation, and diversion of property of public funds. Okay, I think, well, it's more or less, it's quicker, I think, because we don't have as many examples. So the next slide, please. So the topic number 2 in the statistical framework is embezzlement. Well, I already mentioned, these are under Article 17 of the UNCAC. As you can see, we didn't find indicators that are considered as direct. We didn't, and why is this? Because we cannot really ask the population if they experienced embezzlement, misappropriation, or diversion of public funds. So we cannot really have a direct measure. And that's why we couldn't find one indicator there. That's why it's empty. We cannot ask people about their perception of embezzlement, misappropriation, or diversion. It's very specific. We actually ask people about, in general, about the perception of corruption, but this is very specific. And we didn't want to include the perception indicator here because it's really not connected to this topic. But we have other indicators. We have, on the risk indicators, the opportunities and the constraints. So under the risk indicators and opportunity, we have the proportion of total government budget that can be allocated outside the formal budget approval process. So this is about the discretionary power that public officials have to allocate the public budget. And that's why if the percentage or the proportion of the budget that can be allocated is high, then there is a lot of discretion, and that's an opportunity for embezzlement or this type of behavior to happen. Now, in terms of constraints, we have other indicators. We have, for example, the monetary value of irregularities ruled by the Supreme Audit Institution as a share of total audited budget. And this is just to understand to what extent the public funds that are misused are identified. And we will have more reflections on that in the coming slides. Then we have audits. What is the frequency of planned audits and ad hoc audits? And we will also have some reflections around that. Then we have the criminalization. And finally, as we had in bribery, the de facto indicators that talk about the criminal justice sector. So next one, please. We already mentioned this, so we can go to the next slide. So just to show what these indicators are telling us, if the size of the budget is approved outside the formal approval processes, if this amount is high, we can understand that there is lower transparency because usually this is not published. There are higher risks of vulnerability, higher risks or vulnerabilities to corruption, and that they are weaker institutional controls. Now, if indicator number 2, which, as you remember, is misused public funds that are identified, if the share is big, then most likely there is mismanagement of resources in the country. Most likely there are poor procurement practices. Maybe there are many unauthorized expenditures happening. Maybe there's low level of compliance with legal norms. And maybe the level of independence of the Supreme Audit Institution can also tell us some story about what is happening. So more irregularities can also suggest that this institution is free to investigate and it's actually effective in, let's say, flagging these problematic issues when it comes to using resources. Now, if we go to the indicators on audits, let's go to the next slide. So if we see that a country has a huge number or reasonable number of audits that are planned. This means that the management of the Supreme Audit Institution it's good. It shows that it has the capacity to plan according to risks, and that it has a focus on prevention. So it makes sense. You will see this in the next slide because I'm going to show some figures. And then the ad hoc audits, the number of ad hoc audits can be a red flag, because on one side, well, actually it's twofold, because on one hand, it can show that there is some flexibility by the audit institution to maybe answer to complaints or red flags by different stakeholders if they actually add or start an ad hoc audit. But also, if the number of ad hoc audits it's growing exponentially, let's say, then it's a red flag, because then it means that there are many irregularities and that the system is trying to identify mismanagement, but maybe if there are too many, it's not ready to actually act and do this supervision in a way, this oversight. So just to give you a sense of the figures or how can we read the indicators on embezzlement? Next one here. So in here we see scenarios. Let's say we have 5 countries, and you can see all these indicators and maybe how can we interpret this one. So as I was saying before, if we have, for example, country A, and we have that only a very small percentage of government expenditure can be approved outside the formal budget, very little. And then we have that also the cases of irregularity, or the percentage of irregularities in the budget is very low. And then we have that there is an important number of planned audits and also a few ad hoc audits. Maybe we can think that in this country, based on these figures, there are strong controls, Supreme Audit has good planning, and that they are managing the risks. But if we see, for example, another country with a higher percentage of budget that can be approved outside the formal processes, and there are, let's say, a higher number of irregularities that are found, and the number of planned audits and ad hoc audits, it's pretty similar, then we can perhaps think that there are risks. There is some balance over size, but maybe the informal spending or informal approvals is higher, so that can be risky. And now, case number 3, if we see a very high percentage of the share of a very high share of the budget that can be approved outside the formal process, and then we have higher percentage of irregularities that are found, and then we have more ad hoc audits in comparison to planned audits, then we have a red flag. We have that there is a high risk in the system, that Supreme Audit is more reactive, and we can see that maybe governance is weaker than internally in the country. So that's really a red flag that should be reviewed. And the opportunity is, of course, in setting up limits to this share of approval outside the formal procedures. And we can also see how the Supreme Audit can be strengthened. So it becomes more, let's say, professional, because it can plan long-term and it can plan based on risks. So this is just a summary. I'm not going to go into the other 2 because you can already see, but this is just to give you a sense of what these risk indicators, opportunities and risk indicators can tell us when reading in a single approach. If we have all this information in one slide, we can actually see what these indicators are suggesting. And with this, please, Asad, over to you to bring the legal perspective.
As in the previous case, here we also need to analyze the legislation in terms of the content. There is a link between the content of the regulatory act, which actually regulates the auditing, the accounting, accountability, the quality of the procedures, and the practical enforcement of the legislation counteracting embezzlement and misappropriation. So we can understand to what extent the practices of the institution include the provisions on contracting embezzlement and misappropriation. This is usually called the policy of the internal supervision, which is frequently reflected in the template, in the very model policies, and this actually brings to more and more cases of embezzlement and misappropriation and diversion of property. So here we need to look at the following. Article 17, is it reflected? All of the elements of this article, are they reflected in the legislation of the country? Formally, usually all of the provisions are there, but in practice, what do we see? The availability of the legal framework is not enough. We need to go deeper in terms of analysis. So before we analyze the legislation in the context of this article and this indicator, it's useful to organize the focus group discussions with the participation of the auditors, investigators, the internal control officers or compliance control, and the management, the decision makers of the institution. So through this focus group discussions, we could identify the most prevalent schemes of the corruption cases, embezzlement and misappropriation, and to understand whether regulatory norms or internal policies, the compliance control systems are efficient, and to understand whether it is related to the fact that the documents are not efficient in terms of the way they determine the compliance control system, or the embezzlement, for example, was a result of the deliberate actions by the group of the employees. And then we can understand that criminals will always find the way to bypass the current barriers and regulations. Through the analysis of the criminal activity, through the analysis of the criminal activities, we understand the gaps in the legislation. Then, using the anti-corruption screening, we can analyze the regulatory acts which regulate what is identified in the Article 17. So, we can analyze this indicator in a comprehensive way. We would like to draw attention to the fact that this is the statistical accounting, and this system should be always analyzed in terms of its quality. And the final result of the analysis would be used by the law enforcement agency and the higher leadership. So we need to be very clear and specific in terms of the root causes which bring us to these gaps in the legislation. The next slide. What do we see here? We propose to look at the example of how we can better introduce the elements to the report, what should be reviewed, and what is our vision of the theoretical response which will be prepared by the colleagues while analyzing the legislation. So with regards to the indicator which provides information about the regulatory norms on how to manage resources based on Article 9 of UNCAC. Here we analyze the legislative framework and we indicate whether there is a clear difference between the responsibility of those public officials who manage resources and the control mechanism which prevent the abuse of power, and how it is reflected in different instructions or standards. Is there this clear difference? And is there a chance for the enterprises to actually observe? And we clearly assess the legislation, the laws, the bylaws through the group discussions. So we try to reveal whether it is clear to all of the stakeholders. Do they understand it in a uniform way? Because sometimes there is a difference in how it is reflected in a document and how people interpret actually the norms. And then we make a conclusion. So we can say that there is availability of different types of regulatory acts. And then we speak about the key essential elements which are in place and to what extent they are properly reflected. So finally, we need to come up with a very simple determination whether we have the full compliance, partial compliance, or non-compliance. In many cases, we have the non-compliance of the national legislation. I do not think that actually compliance, because I guess there is no country which doesn't have the regulatory framework to regulate the budget processes. So qualitative analysis should be a tool which assesses the way the sector is regulated. This is it on my side. Ms. Salome, I guess we need to sum up.
Thank you, Assad. Yes, I think this brings us to the end of the session. The next slide is really just a question from us to our participants, asking them if you are ready to start these kind of discussions nationally. This is the second session. We will continue reviewing the other indicators, and we are happy to actually answer your questions or organize specific meetings maybe to discuss possibilities and to provide advice on how to start at least putting together some basic information to actually have a better understanding of corruption. This is work in progress. I didn't mention this in this session, but this tool was developed after many consultations in 81 countries with different stakeholders, and the indicators that were included in this tool were assessed very carefully based on the relevance to inform preventive policies and also based on the feasibility to get the data. As you saw from the session today, you already have some information. You just need to maybe work a little bit on cleaning some information and to actually estimate each indicators. Maybe the survey indicators are more challenging, but definitely indicators that are coming from administrative sources are straightforward and easier to get. So looking forward really to continue the discussion and help the participants to work on this data to actually strengthen their evidence-based policy making related to corruption. Over to you.
Thank you. So the main part is complete. We are waiting for your questions, if there are any. Hopefully you do have some questions. Hello once again. Indeed, it was a very relevant topic and it was very interesting to listen to the presentation. We even had some discussions already internally. Unfortunately, because of the limited time, we were not able to deeply analyze the material. So if there is a chance, could you please share with us the presentation so we could look through it once again attentively, and in case of any additional intervention where we could deeply study today's topic on statistical measurement of the corruption, we would highly appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you. I would like to give the floor to our head, the regional representative of the UNODC in Central Asia, Mr. Oliver Stolpe. Over to you, please.
Yes, hello. Good morning. Does everybody hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, fantastic. All right, colleagues, first of all, sorry to not having had the chance to talk to you at the beginning of the seminar. Very glad to see how well these seminars are attended, and even more so how well it seems that the recording of the seminars is then being consumed by people, I guess, predominantly from the region. So this is very encouraging and, of course, a good sign for us and a good incentive for us to continue along those lines. We are also thinking about maybe extending the series or launching a parallel series on other topics. Asset recovery is one of them that we're thinking about, and there might be, of course, other things that are falling within UNODC's mandate areas that might lend themselves to a similar approach. But the one thing, and it is not directly linked to the issue of collecting statistics that give you an insight of how the phenomenon of corruption is evolving in its different facets. But in terms of what is actually the, so to speak, definition of the corruption in your respective countries, and this, of course, links back to the questions of the provisions of the UN Convention Against Corruption and the extent to which those provisions have already been fully implemented in national legislation, which of course is directly relevant to the monitoring of issues. And here I wanted to just to quickly remind the colleagues here on the call, in particular those ones representing different agencies and entities from the Central Asia region, that of course all of you have very laudably completed the first cycle review of the UN Convention Against Corruption, which of course included a very important chapter on criminalization. And we have, of course, also the UNCAC fast tracking platform, which gives us an opportunity to sort of compare notes across countries, identify maybe common gaps, and then also identify shared approaches, which could to some extent be facilitated by UNODC in terms of addressing those gaps. And it is that specific issue where I wanted to use these few minutes to basically maybe remind you that there are quite some legislative gaps, I guess in principle for historic reasons, in the criminal codes of the region when it comes to the question of full criminalization of corruption offenses as established or as contained in the UN Convention Against Corruption. We have seen that quite a number of countries are struggling with the concept of third-party benefits, which essentially means whether it is the bribery offense or it is some of the offenses that are linked to embezzlement and abuse of power, when you're not committing these offenses directly benefiting in your own person, but you're making sure that the benefit goes to a third person. Not all national laws fully cover that concept, and it's very important, in particular, of course, for the obvious, when the benefits go to family members or companies associated with yourselves. But it's, of course, also very important when it comes to the issue of political parties, for example, where the benefit might go to the party, but not necessarily to the offender. So this is a, I think, shared gap for some of the countries in the region, and it would be good to think about this a little bit deeper as respective reforms are being introduced in order to address the recommendations coming out of the UNCAC review. Another issue that we see is in particular the questions of active and passive bribery of international public officials and foreign public officials, especially international public officials. And here I'm talking really about ourselves, essentially, as UN officials, but of course also the other officials of international organizations that are present in and operating in the countries of Central Asia. Their active and passive bribery is not always fully criminalized, and again, that is a gap, and we would very much encourage countries to look into that, and of course we stand ready to help with respective special language. Then there's the issue of the specific offense of illicit enrichment. It is not a mandatory offense, of course, in the UN Convention Against Corruption, but it is an important tool, in particular in environments where still the issue is not yet, so to speak, under control. It can be a very effective tool because it really reduces the level of evidence and the complexity of corruption investigations that are often not successful simply because the requirements in the laws are very high, and illicit enrichment helps to address some of lower the threshold in some extent of those requirements. Of course, that can then also be reflected in the penalties to make it less maybe harshly penalized in terms of the penalties that are being issued, but it is a very effective tool to really reduce tendencies of abuse of power and of embezzlement that we might still observe in some public administrations. And the last point that I wanted to mention, because that's been also something that has been observed by many of the reviews, which is the issue of the proceeds of crime legislation. And that is really an Achilles heel, I would say, in at least some of the jurisdictions of the region. It is not only relevant for your ability to recover the proceeds of crime domestically, and of course addressing essentially the principal incentive for the corruption offenses in the first place, which is greed, which is personal enrichment, but it more importantly prevents countries from being successful in international recoveries. And that is really where I'm going with this specific comment. If the domestic legal framework does not include essentially the basic provisions that allow for the confiscation, the seizure, the tracing of the proceeds of crime, cooperating internationally for the, in particular for the confiscation and the recovery and return of assets that might have been brought outside the country and stashed in the financial centers of this world, these efforts are often then unsuccessful. And I think we need to be very aware of that. And therefore, I'm also strongly encouraging the countries here present to maybe take a second look at their domestic legislation, see whether there were recommendations issued as part of the UNCAC review mechanism with regard to the proceeds of crime and also the management of the proceeds of crime and disposal of the proceeds of crime. And if there are indeed those recommendations, to quickly see what needs to be done in order to address them. And again, of course, I want to emphasize that we stand ready to support such processes as a matter of priority. So I wanted just to mention that quickly because I saw we were delving deep into corruption offenses, and I thought it was a good moment to mention some of those specific issues. So thanks a lot, Azad. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Stolpe. You have highlighted a very important point. Once again, this is the link between the way what is regulated and what is described in the anti-corruption system and the legislation, and what are the results of the regulation. To what extent the anti-corruption system is efficient, and it heavily depends on the way it is determined in the legislation. So once again, I would like to thank you for this contribution and highlighting the practical elements of this link. Now we have some time for the Q&A session. I would like to draw your attention to the fact that we are more focused on the practical matters. We need to discuss how this methodology could be applied. And we are expecting the questions, the practical questions from you. If something is not clear, we will be more than happy to clarify. Moreover, we would like to draw attention to this sign symbol on the screen, QR code, the barcode. If you scan it with the use of your phone, you will get the access to the page where you can tell us about our possible mistakes. So provide us a feedback. We welcome constructive criticism. We'll be waiting for your feedback. Hopefully you will use the QR code. I would like also to mention the following. If you have any specific cases which you would like to discuss within this webinar, we have access to the regional expertise, the region of Central Asia, other regions, so we can bring experts from headquarters. We can find experts from the Asian Pacific. So this could be organized within the series of our workshop. Please send us your questions, your concerns. You can see the contact details. You actually have the contact details, and you can approach Ms. Salome. You can send the questions and concerns to her email, and we will try to include all of these topics to the next webinars. We will further speak about the measurement of the criminal cases in accordance with the UNCAC in terms of the illegal enrichment, abuse of power. These are very complex elements, and hopefully you will invite your colleagues, not only those who are directly involved in the statistics, the record keeping, but also those who are actually drafting the legislation, who are ensuring the enforcement, because these are very closely connected elements. And we would highly appreciate if you could disseminate the link to our webinars, especially the link to the next webinar, because we need to ensure the participation of the economic regulators. All of this statistical framework, this is very practical, and using these indicators, you will be able to include the majority of them, even maybe all of them, fully or partially into your plans or procedures on the evaluation of the anti-corruption measures efficiency, anti-corruption plans, strategies, and other interventions at the level of the country and at the level of the specific institution if we speak about the anti-corruption policies implemented at the level of the certain institution. So please use these opportunities and we will be more than happy to see more and more participants. Colleagues, are there any questions to our distinguished speaker? I do not see any hands raised. We are not that limited in time. We are actually not in a rush. We're very sorry we had some technical issues. So indeed, it was very interesting. The topic is quite relevant and I would like to highlight, yes, we have some questions, but first we would like to examine the topic. We had some internal discussions. So first we would like to continue with the internal discussions and then maybe in case of the bigger issues, when we need some further clarification, we will approach you. We will send you an email. And if we have time at our future sessions, we will talk about these issues. Thank you. Thank you. So we understand this is a very complicated topic. Anyways, we will be waiting for you next time. Please invite more and more of your colleagues. Is there anyone who would like to intervene now, or maybe let us know that you will have something to say on the next topics? We will take this into account. I guess this is it for today. Thank you so much, everyone, for being with us. We'll be waiting for you next time. See you. Thank you, everyone. Best of luck. See you soon.
Thank you. Bye. Спасибо большое.